All right, 4.4 is talking about inequalities with two triangles. This is the last lesson in Unit 4. And so we're going to talk about two triangles still, and we're going to talk about something called the hinge theorem. When you guys think of a hinge, what do you think of? A door. Or Miss Miriam coming unhinged, right? Like just coming off the hinges. So
today?
No, not today.
Why is it getting referred back to me for? I didn't.
Okay, so the hinge theorem means that we're going to swing something back and forth. We're going to be sharing something. Okay, so they're going to share a side and it's going to swing back and forth, going to be able to give us inequalities. So the first hinge theorem that we talk about, if I read this, you're probably going to just give me the stare, the deer in the headlights. But in two triangles, if two sides of one triangle are congruent to corresponding two sides of a second triangle, and then we have an included angle, then that included angle in the second triangle and the third side of the first triangle is greater or less than the corresponding third of the second triangle.
Ooh, that's why you put that.
Right? That is a lot. And what does that mean? All that means is that we need to make sure that we are paying attention to, they are going to have one side that's congruent and one angle that's congruent. Okay, so let's write that underneath the side angle side. They're going to have one side congruent and then we'll probably be able to mark a reflexive side. And then we're going to need to find the included angle. Remember, included means it's between the two sides. So we're going to find the one side that's obviously marked congruent. Then we're going to mark the reflexive side to be congruent. And then we're going to find the angle that's included. Then we're going to have a side hinge theorem. Excuse me. And we'll talk about what that looks like in just a minute, okay? In both of the diagrams, you must have two pairs of congruent sides, which we've already talked about, right? One of them is usually going to be the reflexive side. And then one of them should already be congruent. The hinge angle is always between the two congruent sides. You should underline that, please. The hinge angle is always between the two congruent sides. It's the included angle, the one between the two sides. So remember that inequality means we're using greater than and less than signs. That's what inequality means. We're using greater than and less than signs. So we're going to be setting up inequalities each time we talk about this, okay? So let's do a first example. I'm going to make some notes as we're going through this, and I'd like for you to make the same notes with me, okay? When we're doing this, it's going to be the step-by-step process. So step number 1 is to mark congruent sides. So let's write that. Step number 1, mark congruent sides. So in this diagram, do you see any sides? We know we have 3 triangles that we're dealing with here, but do we have any sides that are congruent to each other?
Yes.
Which ones?
The 12.
The 12s, right? So let's mark this 12 congruent to this 12. Okay? And do you see a reflexive segment? Remember, reflexive is that they share a common side.
Yes.
Do you see that MD is reflexive? They share it. Okay, so let's mark MD congruent to itself. Okay. So now we have the 2 triangles on the sides is what we're looking at. All right, and look at these angles in between the 2 sides. So I have an angle that's 141, and I have an angle that's 9x plus 15. I have 2 angles, and each of them are in between the 2 sides. Do you guys see that? How the angles are in between the 2 sides on both triangles? Okay, so in this triangle I have this side with this side, and that angle is in the middle, right? And then in the other triangle I have this side with this side, and the angle is in the middle between the two sides. Okay?
So how are you allowed to mark those?
I'm marking them separate. Notice that one has one arc and the other one has two arcs, which means they're not congruent. I was just labeling them. That those are the angles that I'm talking about. That's a good question. Okay, step number 2. If I'm trying to find x here, and x is a part of an angle, the first thing I do is I look at the sides that are opposite the angle. I look at the sides that are opposite the angle. Okay, so I have two angles marked. Across from this angle is 16, and across from this angle is 18. Do you guys see that? Across the angles we have 16, we have 18. Which side is smaller, 16 or 18? 16. So we're going to go ahead and write 16 is less than 18. Remember we talked about in lesson 4.2, we talked about if an angle is bigger than the other one, then the side across from it is biggest. Do you guys remember we talked about that in a triangle? When we said like if this side was 100 or this angle was 100, then that means this side over here is the biggest.
Right.
Remember we talked about that? Same concept here. 18 is bigger than 16, which means that the angle that's across from 16, which is 9x plus 15, has to be less than the angle that's across from 18, which is 141. So if this side, 16, is smaller than this side, 18, then that means that this angle across from 16 is smaller than this angle that's across from 18. So that's how we are able to write 9x plus 15 is less than 141. Go ahead and write that out. 9x plus 15 is less than 141. We just look at the angles that are across from the sides. So across from 16 is 9x plus 15.
So you instead of starting from the inside point out, you're going from the outside in.
Yes. Because we're trying to find x, which is an angle. So if you try to find an angle, you have to start with sides. Okay, now let's go ahead and solve this. All right, so go ahead and solve this. So we're going to subtract 15. 141 minus 15. 126.
14.
So x not equal. X is not equal. You have a less than sign. X is less than 14. But let's talk about this. This is where the hinge concept comes in. Okay, I want to talk about this. If I have an angle right here, the most that an angle can be, if I start with 0, right, and then this angle could be like 25, right, if I had an angle right here, then that would be 25. If I had an angle up here, that would maybe 60. This angle right here could be 60. I could make one go straight up, which is 90, right? That angle right there would be 90. And I can go all the way around until 180. So any angle that I have can go from 0 to 180. Would you guys agree with that?
Yes.
Any angle I have can go from 0 to 180.
For what reason? Though?
For an angle, because that's the definition of an angle.
Okay.
Right, we can draw, let me make this a little bigger. We can draw an angle that looks like this. I could draw an angle that looks like this. I could draw an angle that looks like this, right? All of these are angles. And an angle could even be as big as 180 degrees, right? We talked about that with a linear pair, 180 degrees. So here's what I have to keep in mind. if I look at this over here, look back at number 2, I have 9x plus 15 is less than 141. An angle has to be between 180 and 0. It can't be more than 180 and it can't be less than 0. Okay, it has to be in here between 0 and 180. Would you guys agree with that?
Yes.
Between 0 to 180. All right, so if I'm between 0 to 180, if this angle is already less than 141, isn't 141 smaller than 180? It is, right? So it's already smaller than 180. But have I described anywhere where it's greater than 0? Have I talked about that yet? I haven't. So what I need to say, the second part of this is why it's called a hinge, because the angle is hinging somewhere between here and here, okay? Could be between 0 and 180. So I have to figure out what value can I use for x that's going to be, 9x plus 15 greater than 0. So this is what a hinge says. It says that the angle, which is represented by 9x plus 15, has to be less than 180, which is taken care of over here, and greater than 0. So we have two situations we have to figure out. We have to figure out what is it going to be when it's less than 180, and what's it going to be when it's greater than 0. So let's write this as our step number 3. Yep, the angle also must be greater than 0. So we're doing two things. The angle has to be less than 180 and greater than 0. And we've already checked the less than 180. So let's check greater than 0. So we're going to go ahead and solve this. So I'm going to solve this. I'm going to subtract 15. You get x by itself by dividing by 9. Can we reduce 15 over 9?
No. By 3.
By 3. Right? Each of them can be divisible by 3. 15 divided by 3 is 5. And 9 divided by 3 is 3.
Okay,
I just reduced 15 divided by 9 by 3.
you have 5 there, 5 there.
I have 5/3 up there. So because we have two options for our answer, x has to be less than 14, but greater than negative 5/3. This is how you would write your final answer. Less than 14, greater than negative 5/3. All right, I think doing a couple more will help you. So let's go on to letter B. We're still doing step by step.
Is that how you wrote that out?
I put this one on the other side, greater than 5/3. Like this. Let's just do another one and we'll come back to it. Okay? What's the first step? What did we write down was the first step? Mark congruent sides. So let's go ahead and mark. What sides do you see that are congruent for sure? The 12s. Okay, so let's mark the 12s. And then what else? The middle, right? That reflexive piece. Okay, so step number 1 is to mark congruent sides. What's step number 2? Okay, we're going to mark our angles. So I have this 5x minus 14 is down here. It's supposed to be this angle down here. And then we have 46, and we're marking them with two different number of hash marks or arcs because they're not congruent. Now we look at the sides across from them. So I have 14 and I have 15. Which one is smaller? less than 15. Emily, what's the angle that goes with 14? Which angle is across from 14? Across from 14? Right, you see that, how it's across from right there? Okay, so across from 14 is 5x minus 14. Bring down your inequality sign. What is across from 15? 46. So we're going to write our 46 here. Go ahead and solve it for x. Emily said she has x is less than 12. Okay, so let's look here. If the angle is less than 180, isn't it also, sorry, if it's less than 46, is 46 smaller than 180? Okay, so if it's less than 46, it's already definitely less than 180. What's the third thing that we have to do, though? Must be greater than 0. So 5x minus 14 must be greater than 0. And I would write it like this with the 0 on the left side. Okay, let's go ahead and solve that. Rena, you might want to write some of this down. Does 14 over 5 reduce? No. Okay, so we're just going to leave it as, I don't want a decimal. Leave it as 14 over 5. So then our final step is to put x in the middle. Put the big number on the right, smaller number on the left. Hinge theorem means that we could have multiple answers. Okay, let's look at example C. Okay, we're getting the hang of it. Let's look at example C. What's the first thing to do? Mark 2 pairs of congruent sides. So mark your sides. And it might help to write the steps down on this one. Mark, because this one's a little bit different. Mark congruent sides. Crystal, what's one pair of congruent sides that you marked?
1.8 and 1.8.
1.8, 1.8. Josh, what's the other pair that we would mark?
The reflexive side.
Excellent. The reflexive segment in the middle. Then we're talking about the angle that's 62 and the angle that's 65. Okay, so if we think about what we've been doing now, all the other ones we have been trying to find the angle. But on this one, where's our x value? It's a side, right? It's not an angle, it's a side. So if we're trying to find a side, then we have to start by looking at the angles. So step number 2 is look at the angles this time. And I have an angle that's 62 and an angle that's 65. So one of them, the one that's smaller, I'm going to write first, 62 less than 65. Yep. Then where do you think I might go after this? Okay, good. You're looking at the side that's across from the angles, right? So across from 62 is 2.7. And across from 65 3x minus 2.1. Good. Okay, let's go ahead and solve this. There you go. You got what? Check it again. 4.8 divided by, do you have 4.8 divided by 3? What are you doing? Yeah, always. 4.8 divided by 3 is 1.6. Right? Should be 1.6. Now, what was step number 3? What do we have to make sure we do? Make sure that it's greater than 0, but before you begin that, let's look at this. Do sides, look at my diagram for a second. Do sides have a maximum, like do sides stop at 180? They could be whatever, right? Sides could be a million long. But they always have to be greater than what number? 0, right? You can't measure like negative 2 feet. That doesn't make sense. Okay, but if we look at what we set up here, do you see that we already set this greater than 2.7? Right? And isn't 2.7 greater than 0? So if it's greater than 2.7, it has to be greater than 0. So this one we don't have to check twice because it's already been satisfied for us. So this is my final answer here. X is greater than 1.6. Again, I don't have to check the other side because it's already greater than 0. Okay? All right, let's check letter D. First step is to do what? What's always the first step? Mark two sides that are congruent. Do that on number D. Letter D. What? On letter D, what's one pair of sides that you see is congruent? All right, I would mark that. So let's mark the side that has 7 and the side that has 7. Ooh, and 2 6s. Okay, so there in this diagram, there isn't a reflexive side. So now we're going to mark the angle that's included between both of them. So this 7x plus 4 is in between those two sides. What's the angle that's in between the sides on the other one, Emily? Yeah, 140. Good. I'm going to mark it with 2 arcs. Okay. So we're trying to find angles, right? Our x is representing an angle. So if you want to try to find angles, you have to start with what? Do you guys remember? Good, Brianna. You have to start with sides. You're always starting with the opposite. So if you want to find an angle, you start with sides. If you want to find a side, you start with angles. So look at this. We're going to look at the sides that are across from my angle. So I have 8 and I have 12. So which one is smaller? So I'm going to say 8 is less than 12. Which one goes with 8, Patrick? 7x plus 4. Quentin, what's going to go underneath the 12? 140. All right. Go ahead and finish this out. Does it go evenly? It's 136 over 7, isn't it? So we're just going to leave it as 136 over 7. And that seems like a really ugly fraction, but we're going to leave it as such. Josh, can I move this over? Thanks. That's fine. Just right there.
So we're just gonna leave it.
Yeah, we're just going to leave it as 136/7. As part of our final answer, what do we also have to check to make sure the angle is what? Greater than 0. So we have to set the 7x plus 4 greater than 0. And I'd always put the greater than 0 part on the left side of the problem so that you don't mix up any signs. So we get -4. X is greater than -4/7, and that doesn't reduce, does it? -4/7. So I have this as part of my answer, and this is part of my answer, so let's write it one big answer. Put your X in the middle, your signs pointing to the left. 136/7, -4/7. Here's the easy way to remember if you need to set it greater than 0. Okay, so maybe write this at the top of your paper. If X is on the left side of the inequality, that's when you must set greater than 0. So if X is on the left side of the inequality, that's when you must set it greater than 0, when X is on the left side. How do you make a greater than symbol?
No, it's inequality.
Oh, I just wrote the word instead of a symbol. Can you write it as one big thing? Did you write it as one big thing? Oh, okay, cool. So if X is on the left side of the inequality, that's when you must set it greater than 0. I think sometimes students forget when to set it greater than 0. If X is on the left side, that's when you do it. Okay? All right, let's do a couple more examples. It says compare MR with RP. So they're asking us to compare which one's bigger. Okay? So what we are going to do is we're going to write MR. We're going to give ourselves a blank to be able to write the less than or greater than sign, and then RP. Okay, same concept exists. Find the two congruent sides. They've already marked one of them congruent, right? What else should we be marking congruent in this diagram? The middle one, right? And then that means I'm talking about 19 and I'm talking about 21. Which one is smaller, 19 or 21? 19. So we're going to write 19.
19 can be 21. And a big ID.
Well, you make a very good point. 19 can be 21. Did you hear what he said after that?
If you have a fake ID.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so which side is across from 19? RP, right? And which side is across from 21? MR. So we know that RP is smaller than MR. They didn't ask me to find out how much they were. They just asked me to compare them, which one's bigger. And even though I don't know which one's bigger, like by number-wise, I do know that RP is smaller because it's across from the smaller angle. So if we look at this and translate it up here, it would, say that louder, Emily. It would be flipped, right? Because they asked me for MR first, and the bigger sign is pointing to MR. The bigger side is pointing to MR. So when I write it up there, I need to make sure the bigger side is pointing to MR. This is all they want you to do here is just compare them. Which one is bigger? Also, on your paper, it might look like this says greater than or equal to, so make sure that it's not greater than or equal to, it's just a blank for you to put in the sign. So we're going to do the same thing on letter F. Okay, it says compare measure of angles CDF. So let's mark CDF. CDF is up here. Comparing that angle to EDF, which is here. So if we want to compare the angles, we need to look at the what? We need to look at the, thank you, Belinda. We need to look at the sides. So we do still, like you were saying, Emily, we still mark sides congruent. So let's mark this 14 with this 14 and that 14. All those 14s are the same. Wake yourself up. Okay. So I'll have eyelashes. Yes, but yes, you're exactly right. C and F should be congruent, but we don't really care about those right now. Okay, but yes, that's a good observation. Okay, so let's look across from these angles. I have 12 and 13. You guys see that across from the angles? So we know that 12 is less than 13. So which angle is across from 12? Don't just say D. How do you name this angle? C, D, F. Let's write the measure of the angle as well. The measure of the angle CDF is less than the measure of angle EDF. And that's the way they gave me in the question. They said CDF first and then EDF, which is actually how it turned out. So this is our final answer. The measure of angle CDF is less than the measure of angle EDF. Brianna, can you sit up for me, please? Sit up for me, please. All right. Letter G. Says find the range of possible values for x. See what you can do. What's the first thing we always do? Okay. Mark sides congruent. Let's go ahead and mark sides congruent. Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. Mark the sides are congruent. Which sides do I know are congruent here? Not vertical angles, I'm just talking about sides. 50 and 50, right? And I already have the ones on the outside marked. You see that? So this side with this side. Identify what angles we're talking about, please. Mark the angles that we're going to be talking about. Which ones are included? We don't know 47 in the other one. Don't mark those two. Okay, we're going to talk about 68. That's between the two sides. And which one? And 55. That's the other one that's between my two sides. Notice that I'm marking them with... Crystal, are you with me? Okay. Marking them with different arcs. And then I'm going to look at the sides across. Is X a side or is X an angle? Look at where X is. Is it a side or is it an angle?
An angle.
Woo! It's an angle, Patrick? I see a side. X is representing the side. Right? Yeah? Not an angle?
What?
X is representing a side.
Okay.
Okay? So if X is a side, that means we start with what? Thank you. You always start with the opposite. So 68, oops, which one's smaller, 55 or 68? So 55 is less than 68. I want you to keep going on the problem without me. Write this part down.
I'm not gonna have to need to go to church this Sunday.
Keep going. All of you should have your pencils on your papers. Let's go. What's across from 55? What's across from 68? That's where you're going with this. I'm getting x to be less than 9. Is that what you're getting? Okay. Is that all that we need to do in this problem? Thank you, Quentin. We need to make sure that this is also greater than 0. So the final step is to take the 5x plus 2. Make sure that it's greater than 0. Remember I said if x is on the left side of the inequality, which it is over here, then you need to make sure that you set it greater than 0. And you get x to be greater than negative 2/5. So we write our final answer with x in the middle. The arrow is pointing to the left. Big number goes on the right. Little number goes on the left. This is your final answer. You need to have both conditions there. Okay? Any questions on letter G? It's following the same pattern every time. Find your sides that are congruent, find the angle that's included. Then you're going to look across.